Wyoming was a territory before it became a state, and the land was completely free for cattle, people who owned cattle to graze. So you had a bunch of like European investors or very rich people who had cows out here, and that's kind of where the cowboy came from. Is the cowboy's responsibility was literally to ride from one city, and I say city, I mean like tent city, to the next tent city, trying to just round up all of the cows, and then they would get them all together, and then that's when they would do the sortings and the brandings based on who owned what. And that kind of came up with the issue of mavericks. And what mavericks are basically they're cows that don't have a mother. And so that means that there's no brand or ownership that can claim the calf. So kind of like during the time of like Manifest Destiny, and you could have cowboys who could homestead, they were starting to take these mavericks, right, that were unclaimed cows to try to bring up their own herds. Most of the time, cowboys actually had money and they were investing in their own cows, but this changed the dichotomy in the cattle industry in Wyoming, where it was taking money away from these rich cattle barons, who, by the way, owned the newspapers on the East Coast, who basically made up the law in Wyoming and had high enough contacts even in the presidency at the time. So they started making these laws about how cowboys couldn't own cows. And, in response to that, you had people here in Johnson County who were like, you know what, we're going to create our own association and we're going to create our own laws and our own rules.
And eventually there was a man that rose to prominence among local cowboys by the name of Nate Champion. And Nate Champion tried to fight back by forming the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association, which was seen as a way to counter the WSGA's activities. And immediately he was blacklisted. Anybody who was a member of the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association was blacklisted from even collecting cattle. But Nate Champion's organization had a huge following, especially here in the town of Buffalo. So these guys decided to issue a proclamation that they were going to go out and collect their cattle anyway in spring of 1892.
And so they made secondary laws saying, okay, cattle barons shouldn't be able to own cows. So the point is the best solution that the cattle barons could come up with is by deciding to hire assassins from Texas to come here and kill a bunch of people who were a part of the association. And you have to remember, back during the time, they made aliases where they would be outlaws in Texas and then come up here and be sheriffs. And right now, this cabin right here, that is, the sheriff at the time was Frank Canton. And Frank Canton was an outlaw. He was literally set to be hung in Texas, and then was able to run away and come up here and be the sheriff here. Free. Yes. And by the way, he was also working kind of in association with the cattle barons.
To my left now is Frank Canton's cabin, and the story goes that when he was 11 years old, he left his family, who had many children in Tennessee. It was the poorest part of Appalachia, and he went himself to Texas. And the woman that I spoke to that actually owns the property, she said that she feels very bad for him because the kind of person to leave your family and go out to Texas, he didn't have much moral upbringing. And he basically escaped a life of lawlessness, because in Texas he killed a Buffalo soldier and he was tried for it, and they later said that it was either self-defense or basically boys will be boys, because you kill a black soldier, back in the day you could get away with it, and him having very little moral upbringing, he kind of understood this. However, after that he robbed a bank and he joined the cattle drives from Texas up to Wyoming, and when he came up here he got in good with a lot of the cattle barons and became a sheriff. Now, the farm, or the Frank Canton's cabin, moved over here from about 2 miles north on Crazy Woman Creek, but he wouldn't have actually lived on the property, because I'm looking right over there now, about 200 yards is the property of one of the cattle barons. They moved this over here in recent years, but they say above all he was quiet, he was calculated, and they feel bad for him because he was truly a genius. And they say the phrase that I heard that I really like, he had a whole universe going on in his mind of how can Frank Canton land on his feet. He was a very calculating person.
So you guys came from Buffalo this way, right? Did you see John Tisdale Divide? So prior to this episode, these assassins, prior to the assassins coming, allegedly Frank Canton was like assassinating people in town who had association with the Cowboys. So there's this whole story about how supposedly Frank Canton killed John Tisdale, and the reason why was because somebody saw his horse. And he had a very notable and remarkable horse, but he was like said he had an alibi, and he was like in town. Anyways, point is that so prior to this, everybody was like working in Congrue together on trying to get rid of the Cowboys. So they hired the assassins. And do you guys know anything about KC and like Nate Champion and Nick Ray? Okay, so in KC they had that cabin where Nate, and they were like some of the heads of the association here in Buffalo, working for the Cowboys, and that was the assassins' first stop. Was they were going to kill those guys, and so they had a whole day shootout where Nick Ray and Nate Champion were held out into the barn, or sorry, in the house, and I think it was Nate Champion who even wrote a diary about like his experience.
Boys, I don't know what they've done with them two fellows that stayed last night. I feel pretty lonesome right now. Well, they've just got through shelling the house like hail. I heard them splitting wood, and I guess they're going to fire the house tonight. I think I'll make a break for it when night comes, if still alive. Shooting again, I think they'll fire the house this time. It's not night yet. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I ever see you again. Nate D. Champion. And if you want to pan the camera over here, he wrote that the siege lasted many hours, and people could hear this siege going on. And he had one last stand where he gathered all his guns and he ran out the back door. And they shot him like a coward, and they started moving north. But someone who was the neighbor of this man, named Jack Flagg, he overheard the gunshots, and he wanted to come out and help. Of course, they started trying to kill him. He hopped on his horse and started riding north to the town of Buffalo. And the plan was for these mercenaries and their political support, the corrupt political support, to head north to Buffalo, take over the town, and probably kill a lot of people, because the sheriff, or the former sheriff, who had been hired by the Stock Growers Association, he had a list of 70 people to kill, many of which were already killed by the time they murdered Nate Champion. And when Jack Flagg reached the town, they formed a posse of about 200 people and charged south, cutting them off and driving them to the TA ranch. But if you take a look, killed alongside Nate Champion was his longtime friend Nick Ray, who was shot in a very cowardly manner in the same way that Issam Dart was shot by in similar circumstances. He was in the threshold of his cabin, and they just sniped him.
Point is some guys from Buffalo saw them and the shootout and the holdout, and they came to Buffalo to try to warn everybody. So everybody in Buffalo rallied together, and met the assassins here. So the story about this property is the guy who originally owned this property was a very wealthy doctor, and he had not alliances, but kind of like he was acquainted with the people who were in the assassins, right? And so he was like, okay, you guys can come out here and hole up here. So that's where you get to this place and this barn and what happened here. So essentially it was a 3-day shootout. And you had, so kind of like where everybody was is up here on this ridge is where the town of Buffalo was. And then kind of like back here, there was a little spot where they kind of like dug a hole and like held up inside of it. And this was all in April, and if you've ever know anything about Wyoming, March and April, this day is going to deceive you, because most of the time it's like -30, and it's really kind of crazy. So point is they were so cold that they were just drinking whiskey. In fact, they drank so much whiskey that they couldn't really shoot at the barn, because we found I think 120 whiskey bottles. Yeah, that's a lot of whiskey.
In 3 days.
Yeah, in 3 days, all in this area. And the holes that only made it to the barn were from buffalo guns. So nobody really got shot. I think there was 2 guys who ended up getting gangrene because they accidentally shot themselves in the foot. So it was not a very, it was a massive turning point in history in Wyoming, because this was the catalyst between the old way of with the cattle barons versus owning it from the cowboys. But it has kind of a really sad ending, because the cattle barons were able to actually call the president of the United States, who issued the cavalry to come down and rescue the assassins. And they did it under this guise it was unlawful, and they wanted to imprison them. And so they took him to jail, and then they asked the town of Buffalo to pay for the expense of prosecuting them. And then, with the corruption, it just took so long that, basically the town of Buffalo went bankrupt. And then they were let free. So that's kind of like, in short, synopsis of the Johnson County War. And there's way more to this, and like an actual historian could give you more information, but that is how my grandma tells this story.
And how was your grandma involved with the story?
So my grandma and grandpa bought the property from the Gammons, and so kind of like how the property changed hands is, the Gammons made this a Percheron breeding program. Percherons are French draft horses, so they actually supplied the entire nation with working draft horses. In fact, there's pictures here of she's still alive today, but at 3 years old, her sitting on top of their draft horse teams. So there was 200 draft horses on this property. And that's what the granary came into that picture. This is how they would feed the Percherons. And then the Gammons kind of, after a couple generations, the buildings were left open for the animals to reside in. And so when my grandpa and grandma were looking to buy a property here, because my family are Wyoming natives. My great-grandfather was the mayor of Graybull for 2 terms. Do you guys know anything about Graybull?
I don't know.
It's tiny. It's like literally dust bowls across the plains. So anyway, my grandpa went to Denver. He was an attorney, and he did a bunch of work, and kind of like what he wanted to do was come back to Wyoming and come have a ranch like he used to with our great-grandfather. So the point is that this is the place that they bought, and then my grandma actually has a degree in restoration, historical restoration, and so she was able to restore all of the buildings.
As you can probably tell by the name, Dudley Champion was Nate Champion's brother, Nate Champion being sort of the undisputed hero in the Johnson County War. And Dudley rode into Buffalo about a year later in 1893 looking for work, but this was a very poor decision on his part because a lot of the upper class Stock Growers Association, WSGA members, and the WSGA still exists, although obviously they don't do this anymore, but one of them by the name of Mike Shonsey saw him and basically shot him on sight. And of course the court, which was still very corrupt at the time, found Mike Shonsey innocent, but it was said that after the first assassination attempt on Nate Champion's life, Nate Champion rode to Shonsey's ranch and said, "You were one of the 3 people who tried to kill me on November 1st of 1891. I demand you tell me who else was there." And because of this, they almost got into a shootout, Nate and Mike Shonsey. And this caused Mike Shonsey to harbor ill feelings towards the entire Champion family. So when Dudley Champion rode in, Nate saw him and just shot him in the chest. And this was the last confirmed death of the Johnson County War.
And you have to understand, these guys died from sepsis. They had a bacterial infection. They had, so it took them a while to die. So they were secondary. It wasn't from an actual gunshot wound here. It was so they went off the property and were buried in their hometowns. So nobody really died here at all. Just just a very basic gun battle, classic.
120 whiskey bottles.
Yeah.
Anyone's really gonna get
Oh, yeah. They were freezing. They were so cold. So it was really nobody wanted to die. And that's the other thing I didn't tell you guys is that at the end of the battle, what they did is they made a go devil, and what that is it's a wagon where you put dynamite and hay, and so they were going to push this wagon and basically blow up the barn with all the people inside of it, and that's when the cavalry came in and stopped them. At the last minute, at the last second. Yeah. So anyways, and you guys can kind of see there are, so you guys can kind of see over the years, everybody's been put there. So these are brands from other ranches. So this is the Wine Cup Ranch. And you kind of can see all of the carvings. Because this property has been privately owned by so many different people, and you have some ledgers from like 1922 and 1928 and 1931.
What do you think is the most interesting carving here?
This is the TA brand. So that's the original TA brand. That's probably the most interesting one. So kind of what happened with the TA brand is it actually was purchased by somebody in Gillette. And they, I mean, we've been wanting to get the brand back, but it, you know, owning brands is like, it's a $30,000 investment for just a brand. So we have our own family brand that we brand our cows with. But I can kind of show you guys the, sorry. And you can kind of see the bullet holes from this point.
It's wild that nobody died, and it was a
Yeah.
3 full days.
3 full days, yeah.
Well, because
And-
you can kind of see, all they had to do is take that one shot. So right where this butterfly cutout is, there's all of these really big holes, and then this we believe was from like a buffalo rifle or something of really high caliber. So it just takes a couple of those shots for the invaders to realize, oh, you know, maybe that might hit us, and that's why they go downstairs.
Well, do you think the townspeople might not have been aiming to kill?
Maybe, but I think at that range, everything is not aiming to kill. It's just aiming to maybe
They were
hit.
just trying not to die.
Yeah.
Because that's the problem, is there was no cover for them at all. So they didn't believe in it enough to try to, like, you know, be the hero and come in here and try to storm them out, which is why they made the Go Devil. And really, like, I just don't think they were anticipating that somebody would be able to leave and, like, call in the cavalry. So they just thought this was going to be like a siege and they could hold them out. And then, you know, literally the cavalry comes riding in here, like there's a ceasefire and they take everybody out.
Yeah.
So I think that was the main problem. And the problem too is weather. Like the weather here is in March and April is horrendous. Like you can't even see in front of you. That's our blizzard season. So that's why today is like
It's the best day.
yeah, the best day ever. But here, this is kind of where the barn ended, and you can see the cutouts. And then the second half of the barn was added in 1910. So, and same thing with the wings on each side.
I heard in the museum that some people in the local area still kind of view Nate Champion and a lot of the people that were involved with this as not the good guys. Is there any ill will towards the families?
Well, I think part of it is that a lot of these guys ended up settling in the surrounding area, the assassins. And so there was controversy in this dispute because you had people who, you know, on each side kind of living together and figuring it out, and you would have thought that they would have left.
Yeah.
But they didn't. So part of this is like, it's this classic idea of land and land disputes and water disputes, and you still, like, have you guys watched Yellowstone at all?
A little bit.
Okay. Yellowstone is like, it obviously is a dramatization, but at the same time, like, the philosophy and thinking is the same. Like, land is gold here. You know, everybody's trying to make money off of cows. We still have horse theft. We actually still have cow theft. And theft is not the right word, is it? Thievery? I don't know. Anyways, point is, we still have those issues. And then the number one thing is water. And when you hit those trigger points of like people's livelihood, and it's as simple as somebody, like for example, our neighbors, they closed the ditch. So there's these little culverts and there's ways that you can change the water flow. They went and changed the water flow and we were like, why aren't we getting water? Well, that simple act is what makes or breaks your entire, like if you're gonna be able to have enough hay to feed your horses. And so like we actually have ditch riders. So people who are like basically appointed by the government to just make sure that water is getting allocated properly. And literally, if it's not, people are out there with guns, getting each other's faces because you are trying to feed animals. You're trying to make a business out of the land. And so that's kind of the thing that I see the most here. Is not really like this history anymore. A lot of those people who were attached to that history, like there's somebody who's literally related to Butch Cassidy in Buffalo and Casey. Like they're like the great granddaughter or something of Butch Cassidy. And she can tell you like what actually happened because she has like personal letters. But those people are starting to die off, and it's just not as much of a legacy anymore that is kept in Buffalo. But like you can understand, it's Wyoming is a thought process, it's a philosophy, it's a mindset, and that has never changed.
Yeah.
You know, you still get crazy motherfuckers like driving around with guns being like, where's my cow?
So
Yeah.
cattle rustling, that's still, if I were to go on a field and steal a calf, I would just be shot.
Oh,
maybe.
if you trespass, like people are really like, so we have hunters that trespass all the time. And so that is like really kind of a dangerous scenario because people are really hot-headed. And we've had people like shoot into our cow herds trying to get a deer, and they'll shoot into our hay fields and they'll hit like our irrigation lines, which by the way is like a $20,000 fix. So people are really just like not considerate, and most of the time it's like people take trespassing very seriously because it's money. Like if you kill a deer on your property, that's like $1,000 or $500 in an animal fee that you would be getting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like trespassing is a huge deal. Like the land is what makes the money. I don't know, Tucker, what would you have to say?
I feel like if you, people are going to defend everything that they have, and a lot of people out here believe that they own a lot. You know, if this is their land, anything that is on this land is mine. It is mine. So don't go near it, don't touch it, and if you do, then they're going to make sure you know.
That it's not yours.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not yours.
Yeah. And like in the 1900s, and this is what and then you can see the additions that they made. These are the assassins, and this is what the ranch looked like in 1892. So this is the ranch house that we were just in, and then this is the barn. And then this is the cavalry from Fort Phil Kearny, which is where they came from.
Oh, was that the same one with the Fetterman fight?
Yeah, I think so. That's a question for my grandma. She'll know more. And then this is what the Go Devil looked like. And then you can see this is the Cattleman's Stronghold. So when you guys go out there, it's just a tiny little depression in the ground. And so you can see like what they did to hole up.
And so the museum in the town of Buffalo is actually pretty informative. So you have some of the earlier actions that were committed by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and their hired enforcers. You have a couple of people who were killed, hanged, including even law enforcement like rangers. And this was kind of the WSGA saying that we are the law in this part of the country. And so they bring up their invading forces who move right on up to the town of Casper. And the whole way up, they are cutting phone lines, or rather at the time it was telegraph lines. They didn't want the news to reach up to the town of Buffalo that these men from Texas had arrived, about 60 gunmen. They were very well trained, and they were going on a tour with the territorial legislature. And here also you can see Ella Watson and Jim Averill were hanged, and it was a brutal hanging. It was just ruthless what they did to those two people. And so they come up here and they meet in Casper, and they come up to Nate Champion and Nick Ray's cabin. And that is the two graves that we saw a little bit earlier. And Flagg was the man who heard the shootout over at Casey Ranch, rode his horse up and said, "What's going on?" They started shooting at him. So Nick Flagg ran up to the Perry Ranch, the TA Ranch, finally to Buffalo to spread the word, hey, these mercenaries are coming and they probably intend to take out the entire town. And so there was a siege at the TA Ranch, which is where we're headed to next, and they had to come all the way back down after being relieved by the fort because one of their men escaped, went to an army fort, brought out the military. They occupied the town. They still said we're pretty much on the side of the WSGA, and the mercenaries went back to Texas, but it was still very much, they were in control of the corrupt local government there. But we're going to go see the TA Ranch now. Long after the Johnson County War had officially ended, killings went on along the same grain. Wealthy cattle owners would hire out stock detectives to go and eliminate their competition. And this is evidenced by the murder of Willie Nickel. He was murdered on July 18th of 1901, and he was a very young child. And the story goes that one of the neighboring ranchers went and hired Tom Horn, an infamous killer that was hired out during the Johnson County War. He killed people like Issam Dart and was more or less just a hitman. He saw Willie Nickel wearing his father's coat and hat and riding on horseback. And even though Willie Nickel was just a young teenager, he shot Willie Nickel. And as he was sitting along with a sheriff and a sheriff's deputy, they were both in plain clothes in a bar, Tom Horn was bragging, "Yeah, I killed that kid a few days ago." So the sheriff was able to get enough testimony and incriminating evidence to finally convict Tom Horn of the killing. And Horn spent the last 3 years of his life, rather 3 months of his life, weaving his own noose. He really thought he'd get away with it because he was in good with all of the cattlemen and a lot of the corrupt politicians still in Cheyenne. But Willie Nickel was buried here in the backyard of the Stock Growers Association. On my left side here is Crazy Woman Creek, which flows all around the town of Buffalo, Wyoming, where a lot of these events happen. And the story goes either one of two things, and we have no historic documentation for either, but one story says that it was a crazy Native American woman whom everybody else just kind of let live on her own in a teepee along the creek. Another story goes that it could have been a wagon train and that the Native Americans killed this woman's family and they saw her as no real direct threat, so she lived distraught next to the creek for the rest of her short life. And from talking to the family here, they say that the office, the kind of home, is on top of an area which they feel is blessed, and that just up over the hill they see that there is a circle of teepee rings, and they feel that that area has a more positive energy, but that this creek flows through it, and there's a lot of, they say, not necessarily evil feelings. They do feel evil feelings, but that there is also, you would call it, residual hauntings. They feel that half the hauntings are from the people in the town, but that the other half are sort of energies that are attached to the land. And this happens along the Crazy Woman Creek right here.